This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin. With me this week are two amazing human beings, Paul Jasley.
Hello.
And Tia Vasiliou.
Hello.
Thank you both for joining me this week. We have a killer topic coming up after the break for the episode. But before we get to that, let's talk about the thing we talk about every week, and that's comic books. Paul, how have you been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you.
I've been good. I'm enjoying the holiday weekend here in the United States, Memorial Day weekend. And I've spent the time this past weekend reading some comics. It's been fun. So
nice.
A couple highlights I want to mention. I did read Love and Rockets number 5. This is the new issue. And, you know, I don't want to give too much away for people that haven't read it yet, but it's another perfect issue. I feel like every time an issue of Love and Rockets comes out, it's like seeing an old friend you haven't seen in a while and just pick up right where you left off, and it's great. So
That's awesome.
This issue, the Jaime Hernandez stories are about Maggie and Hopi. It's about them now, women in their late 40s, early 50s, their relationship together, how they interact with each other. And then he intercuts that with flashbacks to when they first started dating, back when they were teenagers. And just to see the parallel story he draws, where you see the same characters over a span of 35 years interacting in a similar way. And you can see how that past relationship still is relevant to them now as adults. And there's like one panel in this issue that like really hit home for me. It was like, reading those stories, I always relate to Maggie more, but there's one panel where he draws Hopi, the character that always seems to be a little bit mean to Maggie. He draws her in a way that made me sympathize with Hopi in a way I never had before. And I just love the fact that reading this comic book for years and years, it's been going on for 35 years, there's still always a moment though where I fall in love with it all over again. And that happened in this issue.
That's awesome.
I also want to mention very briefly, I did read Justice League No Justice numbers 2 and 3. I'm enjoying this book. It's a 4-issue miniseries kind of resetting the stage for the Justice League. It's all sorts of crazy cosmic superhero stuff involving Brainiac, Brainiac 2, giant celestial giants called the Omega Titans that show up. Crazy stuff. But sure. I really enjoy it because on this issue 2, you had art by Francis Manapul, who also did issue 1. And you have issue 3 is done by Riley Rossmo. So they're very unconventional artists for big superhero stories. And I love it when DC does that and lets somebody draw the Justice League that doesn't normally fit the typical superhero style.
Yeah.
I just want to critique that, though. It seems like they didn't have enough time to do it because the art looks really rushed, especially Rossmo's art in issue 3. There's some panels that you can tell like he didn't have enough time to really finish. And it kind of distracts from the story, as well as the fill-in artist, Marcus Toe, whose style doesn't fit with either of those guys. Had to do a couple pages. But it is nice to see them do a story like that with unconventional artists. So that's just want to mention those. I am enjoying that series. I'm kind of excited to see how it wraps up this week.
One thing that's interesting, I think, about Riley Rossmo on these DC books recently, I think he's been doing DC books on and off for the past couple years, is that his style has become really synonymous with like creepy, weird stuff whenever they need to do that in, say, like a Batman book, which is pretty much all that I've seen him in. Right. And I'm guessing this Justice League book, did they kind of embrace that with his art style, or like is this a weirder book in any way?
It is a strange book, and you have an assortment of characters. Like the Justice League is broken up into 4 different teams, and there's like weird pairings in the teams. Like one of the teams has Martian Manhunter and Starro the Conqueror, like the giant starfish in it, which is kind of strange to see. Exactly. And there's one team that has like Wonder Woman, but the Demon is in it. And like when he draws the Demon, it definitely kind of leans into these sort of demon-esque features of the character in Rossmo's art. So I think his art does work with the story. It just kind of feels rushed at points. And I guess when you're doing a 4-issue miniseries, it kind of seems like he should have had that stuff figured out. What's funny is Rossmo wasn't even solicited to do that issue. Francis Manapul is supposed to do all 4 issues. So it's pretty obvious that they ran into a time crunch and had to get somebody to fill in. So it's interesting that they did go with someone like Rossmo, who again is an unconventional superhero artist.
Gotcha. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, Tia, how have you been? How have comic books been? So on.
Well, this weekend is the dance recital, the big spring dance recital studio where I coach the competition team.
Ooh.
So it's been a week of tech rehearsals and things, not super a lot of time for comic book reading, but I did read Dr. Aphra number 20 because I noticed that only Cy Spurrier is credited as a writer now.
Oh.
I didn't know that was happening.
I knew that Gillen was going to eventually go off the book. I just didn't realize it was going to be so soon. I thought he was sticking around for a while.
I didn't know either. And as some of you might know, I was a little bit not entirely on board with the Cy Spurrier taking the wheel of Dr. Aphra, because although I have liked Cy Spurrier books, I really was not a huge fan of his most recent creator-owned Angelic. I just felt was like a weird sort of tone-deaf take on something that's kind of already been done, and he's like, why don't we do it with animals that talk? I don't know. Anyway, was not a fan. And so I was like, what's he going to do with Dr. Aphra, my beautiful, precious, space wife? And it was actually fine. I needn't have worried. It was great. It was it felt like Dr. Aphra. It was all the things that you want.
For the record, Tia's notes say Cy Spurrier. I'll allow it.
I tried to find that GIF from Community, but you know what I mean. So Kev Walker is still doing the art. So it's and the writing is like it's the right tone. It's very Dr. Aphra, and I actually really loved this cover by Ashley Wright. So that was nice to see. Anyway, the book, the story is kind of told with the premise that so Aphra is she's imprisoned, and there was an incident, and so she's being interrogated about the incident. And in her Aphra way, she's very sarcastic, and you could totally see her manipulating everyone, and as she tells her story, you could see all the places where it's like, okay, what do you have up your sleeve here? And the interrogators are also picking up on that. So I don't know that she's going to be able to weasel her way out of this one in the way that she hopes. But of course, that's what really makes a good story, when you take a character who's really good at doing things a certain way and then not let them do it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
So I really like that. I really like that Cy Spurrier is not going to let her get away with being Aphra, just because it's charming to I would read that, but it's actually kind of, going a little bit deeper and pushing her to make her kind of, I don't know, figure out another way. And because she's in deep shit right now, because, her MO is to basically fuck people over and then hope that they don't come after her. So, just because you were able to pull that off with Darth Vader, which, on a long enough timeline, are you really able to pull that off with Darth Vader? I don't know. So she's also done that with the murder bots. And I don't think that she's going to get away with that either in the way that she's hoping. So then there was a neat twist at the end where it's she kind of has to eat crow, maybe also other things, if this character shows up to, save the day for her in some way, which we all kind of hope that that's going to happen, I think. And we throw a love interest in there. That would be great. She needs that complication on top of everything else.
Of course.
I would like to see her beg for some forgiveness.
Well, who knows? Cy Spurrier, he's taking the wheel. We'll see, right?
Whatever. I kind of hope that he drives her off a cliff in some spectacular fashion, because I think she'll be okay, but I really want to see how she gets out of it.
Right. Well, for me this week, I read a whole bunch of books. I actually sat down for 5 hours of straight comic book consumption. I spent an entire night. It was a great feeling. But the one thing I want to talk about is this book that I picked up off of a ton of different recommendations from people. And maybe I'm very, very late to the game on this, but I read Extremity number 1 through 12, which is the whole series. This is by Daniel Warren Johnson, and I didn't write down who did the colors for this book, and I feel like an asshole because, honestly, I need to find this colorist. But still, this is Extremity number 1 through 12 from Image Comics. All I can say about this book is holy shit. That's it. I mean, honestly, this is such a cool fantasy dystopia of where it feels like Mad Max meets some high fantasy story, but everything's powered by flying gasoline ships, and there was a war of some sort, and the world is shitty, and now we've got these two warring factions. The story opens with this beautiful, terrible moment where people die, people lose limbs, which is kind of the focus of the story. Extremity. Daniel Warren Johnson, in the back of the book, he says his inspiration for this book was, his greatest fear, which is losing his right hand. And as an artist, that would totally just destroy his life. And so he decided to write a character that was all like that. And I really don't want to go through the plot of this book because on the whole, this book is fucking amazing. The coolest thing happens in issue 11 where there are two-page spreads in a row that make me shudder and cry with absolute awe because it's like orc stain level detail, but in 2-page spreads. I honestly spent probably 10 minutes just on the first half of issue number 11 of this book because there was so much he put into it, and I can't even imagine how he was producing this month to month. He must have done this way in advance in order to meet deadlines, because the amount of just absolute precision and detail in this whole book from issue to issue is astounding. I mean, if you want some seriously cool, action-packed, pretty gory, really fucked up, heartbreaking story, like Extremity 1 through 12, I can't recommend it enough. This is a book that I grabbed all in digital, and I think if it comes out in a collected hardcover, I'm going to get this, because it would be just, I can't imagine what it looks like in person, because I never actually saw the single issues, but the digital versions were fucking mind-blowing. So, this book.
Interesting. So, yeah, who publishes this? I'm sorry.
Oh, this was published by Image.
Okay.
And it feels so Mad Max in a lot of ways, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Just like the feeling of the peoples living in this kind of barbaric former future world where they don't know enough about anything else that goes around them. They just know how to fix the quote unquote magic machines that they have.
Sure.
And they introduce some really interesting characters throughout, and man, I love this book. I can't believe I didn't buy this when it first came out, because I was like, Extremity, that looks stupid. And just like other books that I've done that with, I was completely proven wrong. The other one of notable exception would be Sweet Tooth, where I was like, a kid with antlers, that looks stupid. And then, of course, years later, I read it and I fucking cry my eyes out because it's such a beautiful book. So what I'm trying to say is don't underestimate comic books just because you think they look stupid.
Or just read the ones that Mike tells you look stupid.
Right. Yeah, if Mike says a book looks stupid, you know it's a good choice.
Damn.
He's judging them by the covers.
That's great. But, enough about what we've read recently. Otherwise, I've been good. I could say that. The weather here in New York has been hot and great, I guess, but also terrible. But let's talk about comic books that are coming out this upcoming week. Comic books are released on May 30th, 2018. What are you both excited for? Let's start with you, Tia.
Well, Vagrant Queen #1 is coming out from Vault Comics. If you listened to my Not an Interview with Mags, you know that some of it got cut out because of audio gremlins, but the part that got cut out was us talking about Vagrant Queen. I'm so excited I can't even say it. And it's being written by Mags Visaggio and art by Jason Smith, and it's basically about a deposed child space queen who has to return to this hostile kingdom years later for reasons. And it sounds awesome. It's just the kind of book that I think Mags is gonna just knock out of the park. And of course, Vault Comics is knocking everything out of the park. So really, this is all good.
I mean, to go with that, Vault Comics, I don't think there's been a Vault comic book that I've picked up that I didn't like.
I know.
Which is why I've refused to pick up any new ones, because I'm reading too many fucking Vault comic books.
They're taking over the world, man. I don't know what to tell you.
Will it break my heart? Because I'm reading Eternity Girl right now by Mags, and it's breaking my heart every issue.
No, I know, right? Every single issue is just a
God.
gut punch. I think this one is going to be a little more fun space opera, but I'm sure it will still have its touching moments, because I feel like Mags is really good at throwing those in there, and so even when you think that we're all having a good time, all of a sudden you're like, oh, feelings.
We're all having a bad time.
Feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. Paul, what are you excited for this week?
My choice this week is kind of interesting because it is Aquaman Jabberjaw Special Number 1. This is another one of the DC Comics and Hanna-Barbera crossover one-shots. Way back when they announced they're going to be doing more of these, I joked on Twitter that I really hope they do an issue where Aquaman meets Jabberjaw, and here it is. They're finally doing it. So this is the one-shot.
Wow, they should send you comps.
Right? It was my idea.
This is Paul's way of saying that he got a job working for DC Comics, guys. This is his last episode.
Yeah, of course, the one thing I would do is have Aquaman team up with Jabberjaw.
Right.
This is written by Dan Abnett, art by Paul Pelletier. And if you don't know who Jabberjaw is, I assume you know who Aquaman is. Jabberjaw is based on a Hanna-Barbera cartoon from the late 60s. He is an anthropomorphic great white shark who plays the drums in a rock and roll band called the Neptunes in the year 2067.
What? Okay, and him and Aquaman are going to kiss, right?
Hopefully. If I had my druthers, that's how the issue would end.
Yeah.
He's a anthropomorphized shark that plays the drums.
Right, in a rock and roll band called the Neptunes.
What instrument would you have an anthropomorphized shark play?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Total sense.
It would be hard for him to play like guitar or something.
I guess if he's got to be in a band, I guess that's what.
Because you can wrap your fins around some drumsticks, but you can't get all the chords with your fins.
Right. Yeah, so it's limiting. So he found his niche on the drums.
Yeah.
He's a big shark. He's going to meet Aquaman. I'm very excited for this book. And if that wasn't enough, there's a backup story in this issue that'll be a Shazam meets Captain Caveman team up, written by Jeff Parker with art by Scott Collins. I mean, this book was written specifically for me. Can't wait.
It probably says to Paul in the on the first page.
I sure hope so.
Open dedication 2-page spread. Paul's head photoshopped onto Superman's body for Paul. Oh my gosh, that just killed me. I'm like crying over here.
Read some Eternity Girl. It'll cheer you back.
Yeah.
Up.
Oh yeah. Let's just bounce that right. Let's put the Red Bull in the vodka and have a good night. So okay, for me this week, I'm really excited about a book that's a bit darker than Aquaman and Jabberjaw, I'm guessing. The Wilds. This is the Wilds number 3 by Vita Ayala and Emily Pearson with colors by Marissa Louise. I've been reading this book since, we had Vita and Emily on the show, and I'm really digging it. Like, Emily's art just slays me every issue. Like, I want like a wordless issue of someone running through a forest, and you just see hundreds of these, like, wilds or aberrations or abominations or whatever they call them in the book, just because the styles that she comes up with of people with fungus growing out of their face and necks and arms and vines and flowers, it's gorgeous. Every single issue's got like a handful of unique abominations in it, and it's stunning every time. And it also helps that the story's really cool. There's a lot of mystery and a lot of like I guess erratic feeling throughout the entire thing. The story that's picked up from issues 1 to 2 is there's something amiss out in the wilds. Maybe the abominations are grouping together, which is very out of the regular as far as these runners are concerned in the book. And if you're not reading the wilds, oh boy, there's a lot to unpack. You should just go listen to our episode with Vita and Emily where they talk all about that book. But ultimately, there's a lot of really cool things happening in this book. It doesn't feel like your standard zombie story, and quite honestly, it's not. Issue 2 opens up with a big like slap in the face to this isn't a zombie book, in a really, really cool way. And the one thing that I've really enjoyed about this series so far is the backup like stories that they do at the end of each issue, which is like a focus in on one of the runners. These people that travel between the various fortresses across the countryside, where people can kind of live and survive, and away from these abominations. And there's just a whole lot going on in this book. And even with 2 issues, I feel like there's so much more that can be unpacked. And so I'm really excited to get further in this story. And issue number 3 should be more touching on the uncertainty that's out in the wild, more so than usual. So I'm really excited about that.
Interesting.
Yeah, something I think that is so fundamental to the zombie genre is the aesthetic, and I think it was so smart for them to be like, instead of looking for, I don't know, a narrative twist on the zombie story, like an aesthetic twist on it is just so brilliant.
Yeah. And just the way that it manifests is such a cool thing too. Like it's almost beautiful in a lot of ways, except for the part where the abominations are trying to kill you.
Well, yeah,
So I've been really enjoying this book. So everyone should go out there and buy this. Support Vita and Emily because they're doing fantastic work on this series. But we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we have a very special guest, someone who knows a whole heck of a lot about comic books, and is here to talk to us about a very special thing going on in Seattle. For our show this week, we have a very special guest. Ben Saunders from the University of Oregon is here to talk to us about a really cool thing that he's doing in Seattle right now, which is in Washington. Ben, how are you doing? Welcome to the show. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me. I am a professor of English at the University of Oregon, where I founded the world's first minor in comic studies. I'm pretty sure it was definitely the first one in the USA anyway.
Okay.
And I'm the curator, the chief curator. There's a big curatorial team, but I'm the chief curator for the Marvel Universe of Superheroes exhibition at MoPOP in Seattle right now as well.
Awesome. And so this exhibit is like this monstrous thing. It's funny, we were at Emerald City Comic Con where Paul met you, and we went to the MoPOP exhibit there. They had a big Star Trek thing. Did you guys take over like the 2 floors for the Star Trek exhibit?
Yeah, it's actually quite a bit more space than the Star Trek exhibit. It's the biggest physical show they've ever had at MoPOP.
No way.
About 300 individual items or pieces in total. And that's including things like the sculptures that we had commissioned, the original art, the props from Marvel Studios, and a lot of what we call infographics, media tables, that kind of thing.
Very cool. And you said you have props and things like that from movies. Is there like any specific movies that you pulled from for that?
Oh, sure. So we have movies and TV shows represented. So
okay.
Obviously one of the things that people got most excited about just recently, we have the 3 of the costumes from the Black Panther movie. We have the Panther costume itself, and Okoye's costume, and Shuri's costume, including the cool punchy gloves. The sort of
oh, cool.
Yeah. We have stuff from from the TV shows. We have Luke Cage's bullet-riddled hoodie, which was something that I was really excited to be able to display.
Definitely.
Yeah. We have. What am I forgetting? From Sony were really great. They gave us the one of the costumes from Spider-Man: Homecoming. They actually gave us the sort of DIY costume that Peter has to pull together when Tony takes his suit away. Mm-hmm. So that kind of, pseudo Ben Reilly Spider-Man costume. And we have some things from the earlier movies as well. Pumpkin Bomb from one of the Tobey Maguire movies, the Goblin Mask, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But that's in combination with, the Spider-Man display is actually one of the richest and most detailed. Because we have things like the last 3 pages from the death of Gwen Stacy, the Amazing Spider-Man 121, the actual original art from that book, as well as pages by Ditko, Romita, McFarlane, all the artists you would probably think of if you're thinking of the most influential Spider-Man artists of the last 50 years. We have something by each of them, including a page from Amazing Fantasy 15, which we borrowed from the Library of Congress.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah, actually, that page. So that's a good story. I wanted to borrow the whole origin story from the Library of Congress. It's 11 pages, as you probably know, and we could have put that into one gallery space, but they don't loan out the whole thing ever. They will only lend out a page at a time, and they will only lend it for a few months at a time. Mm-hmm. And if other pages have been loaned recently, they will they take them back, and they only let you have them on this sort of 3-month rotation. They sort of let them rest before they will loan them out again. So initially, I wanted the last page. I wanted when they realized they wouldn't let me have the whole thing, I thought, okay, well, let's have with great power there must also come great responsibility. Let's have that page. But that one had been apparently loaned out fairly recently, and they wouldn't let me have that one. So I chose page 7, which is the first time that he appears in costume. And I'm actually now really glad that I chose that page, because as I was showing people around the show, I realized, looking at this, given what we know about how this was created, there's a brief moment in human history where that drawing of Spider-Man was the only drawing of Spider-Man to ever happen, right? It's the first one.
Right.
So there's a brief moment where that was the only drawing of Spider-Man in the world. And we have it right there on the wall.
Wow.
That's sorry, go ahead, Tia.
Oh no, so when you were putting together your checklist, were you thinking about a specific narrative that you would hope people would walk away from? Like, are you emphasizing the connection between the movies and the comics, or were you trying to give them a sense of kind of what you were just talking about, how important some of these first appearances or original drawings were to the imagination, the public imagination this character eventually enters into? I don't know. Could you talk a little bit about what narratives you were keeping in mind as you put together the show?
That's a really excellent question, Tia, because it's actually it was one of the biggest challenges we faced. The Marvel universe is woven out of story elements that are 80 years old, and actually the Marvel universe is a Marvel multiverse that involves different iterations of the same characters and story arcs across multiple different media platforms, and it's also the story of the men and women who created the characters. So, and I perhaps over-ambitiously, but it felt like it was an ambition that was suitable to sort of the operatic sweep of the subject. I wanted to try and tell all of those stories in some way. So I wrote an 80-page illustrated script, which was kind of a wish list. That's how we began. Once it was clear what my job was going to be, I wrote this 80-page script that had different beats in it that would tell different versions of these stories. And the idea was to be very comics-centric, because that's what I'm most interested in. I mean, I go to the movies and I like the movies, but I'm really a comics person. And so it was comics centric, but I wanted to be able to move across different media. So, for example, with a single character like Spider-Man, like that gallery I mentioned, each wall would sort of have a different function. There's a kind of you don't need to tell people the origin story, right? So, but you might need to tell them something about who Steve Ditko is. So I would just sort of in each gallery, I made different choices about what struck me as, and I mean, I really just sort of allowed my own taste to guide me from that point of view as to what aspects of the multiple different versions of the Marvel narrative we might focus on I was going to emphasize in each room or around each character. But the larger structure of the show is sort of loosely chronological in that we actually begin with sort of the prehistory of the superhero with pulps and newspaper strips. One of the nicest items that you see when you first walk in is an Alex Raymond Flash Gordon original from 1936. Wow. So that's and there's a lot of. I was working with a really brilliant design team, this Berlin-based design team called Studio TK, and they were not comics fans to start with. I was sort of bombarding them with information for the last 12 months, sending them images and emails, but they were really good at taking a large amount of what you might think of as the nerd lore and reproducing it in visually accessible ways. So we begin with, here's a kind of, actually we begin with a movie which does a sort of a 7-minute history of Marvel the company. So beginning with Goodman in the 1930s and the original superhero boom of the 40s, and then Wortham and the moral panic around comics in the 50s and the contraction of the industry, and then Stan and Jack in the 60s. We do a kind of a 7-minute version of Marvel history that just to give people a sense of how this almost sort of a mom and pop kind of outfit with a very small number of people working. I mean, when in the late 50s, early 60s, this is a company that is only allowed to distribute 8 books a month. This is really a pretty small operation, and now they are one of the most recognizable media franchises in the world. So how did that happen? Right. So we tell that story we try to tell sort of a 7-minute version of that story, and then as you go through the show, there are plenty of opportunities to sort of dig deeper and get more information on aspects of creators or characters through the media tables. And I also repeat some of those main beats. So here's popular culture before the superhero ever came along. Marvel were great about letting us actually, have Flash Gordon in there. They realized that they didn't have to. I could tell this story more effectively if they didn't insist that we pretended that the Marvel universe doesn't exist in relation to anything else. Right.
Right.
And so it's more powerful when you then walk into a gallery and you see a copy of Marvel Comics #1 from 1939. If you know why that comic was a big deal in 1939, if you know how new the superhero concept is, and so it seems to have worked. I mean, people are blown away the moment they walk in because they're given that sense of some of the rarity of some of the things that they're about to see. Mm-hmm. They've already been told a kind of a story that they then are going to see little beats from again. And every time you see it, it's like it makes you feel smarter. It's like, oh yeah, I know that. It's because we just told you that. But now you could say, oh yeah, I remember that. And so we had things like the Marvel Comics #1, but then Jim Halpern was willing to lend the only surviving page of original art from Marvel Comics #1, and we could put these two things side by side. So that was a great historic opening, and then we moved very quickly into the characters that people know. I'm giving you a really long answer to the question. I'm sorry. I'm going to start. Does that sort of answer the question?
Yeah, because you do sometimes, I think, see pop culture exhibitions, and they're just sort of like, hey, here's some fun stuff that you like. And this show seemed to have more of a, I mean, it sounds snobby to say an intellectual point of view, and I don't mean it in a snobby way, but just in a we're trying to do something a little more than just like, hey kids, comics.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean, God, I didn't want to do that, and right. I've done. This is my 5th show now, and I've had some time to think about the challenges of trying to present not just popular material in a museum context, but comics present some very specific problems from the display point of view. Actual old comic books, I love them. They exert a almost hypnotic compulsion over me, but but they don't necessarily display terribly well. They're small, right? So it's like trying to build displays out of collections of miniatures if you're focused just on old comic books. At the same time, I didn't want the movie material and the big spectacle stuff to just end up taking over from the comic books. So, so original art is the way that you can do that, I think. I mean, it's most people just haven't seen a lot of original comic book art from the classic era of Silver Age Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
Marvel themselves didn't keep it. It always returned. The pages that had not been stolen were returned to the artists in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then those artists generally sold the pages that were returned to them. So, all of this material has been in private hands. So, if you can find those kinds of collectors, and if they are willing to lend, then you can show people something that they really haven't seen before, but which is still fundamentally comics, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So what people haven't seen is, even if you've read, your favorite Silver Age Marvel books till the covers fell off, and even if you own the reprints, what you haven't, the printing technology was so cheap that an enormous amount of visual information that a lot of the artists are putting into those black and white originals just doesn't make it to the printed page.
Right.
So even for a real hardcore fan, if they're looking at a piece of original art for the first time, they're blown away by the kind of detail that you can see there. So for me, it was the original art that takes the show to the next, and not having just a lot of reproductions and a lot of, maybe there's actually, the smell of Benedict Cumberbatch is still somehow attached to, it's more than that. I remember standing in front of, we got the cover of Spider-Man 122 in there, which is a Gil Kane, John Romita cover, and it's the death of the Green Goblin. It's one of the, it's just again part of that larger Death of Gwen Stacy storyline.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I noted that I hadn't noticed in reproduction, but that you can see in the original, is that Romita has created the effect of motion lines on that original with a knife edge. He's gone into he's inked the page, and then he's gouged tiny little marks out of the ink with the edge of a scalpel or an X-Acto knife.
Wow.
And there are dozens and dozens of these tiny marks. It must have taken a really long time.
No way.
And you can't see that until you're standing in front of it. I remember pointing it out. I think on the opening night, we had this incredible party, and hip-hop legend DJ Pete Rock was the supplied the music for the after party. And so I gave him a personal tour of the show, and we were both standing there in front of this original, just blown away, because we both knew the book. And this guy went in there with a knife and made these tiny little marks. Now, and it's that sort of at moments like that, it seems to me that the distinction between what people think of as fine art and commercial art really starts to break down. And you start to have what feels like a real museum experience, which doesn't have to be, which when it's good, doesn't involve things being very stuffy and dull. A good museum experience is one that will give you, I hope, some feelings of awe every now and again. That you'll actually feel just blown away by what human beings can do with their hands.
That kind of that raises a question in my mind, actually. Sorry to interrupt, but did you feel a sort of responsibility to make that point across and sort of honor the creators that haven't really gotten their due in mainstream popular culture, the recognition?
Yeah, no, I really really wanted to do this, obviously, for Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko in particular. And it was a sort of, you give people a binary choice, and they will end up ignorantly lining up on one side or the other based on all kinds of personal prejudices. If you say, crunchy or smooth, or, John or Paul, and there's a version of that now that happens with Stan and Jack.
Right.
And I wanted to avoid that. If insofar as that is possible. I am not somebody who has, but I also knew Stan didn't need me to give him any credit, right?
right. He doesn't need any help with that. Yeah.
Yeah, Stan just doesn't need help with that, exactly. And I wasn't going to pretend that he played no role. Mm-hmm. There is a sort of a generation of there's a particular species of Jack Kirby fan out there who seems to want to, in some sort of weird Oedipus kind of way, they want to kill Stan Lee and marry Jack Kirby, and and there's just no need for that.
Right.
But there is some need to let the audience know. I mean, this happens all the time when I'm giving public talks to people who aren't necessarily comic fans. Everybody in the room has heard of Stan. Very few of them know Jack's name. That is a historic injustice. And to the extent that I can do something to redress that balance, I wanted to do it. So there was a challenge here in that right now it's a little harder to get people to lend Kirby art than it was maybe even 3 years ago when Charles and I worked on the big Kirby exhibition at Northridge, because the Kirby estate is now going after collectors as well as having I get now that the Kirby estate has settled with Marvel and Disney, they are trying to get pieces of the sale of any Kirby original that goes on sale now. And this has made a number of collectors more reluctant to lend Jack's stuff. But we still found people who were willing to do it, and so that was I knew in the end that with Marvel's permission to reproduce anything that we wanted, it would be okay. But I would have liked to have had maybe 5 more Kirby originals than we ultimately did have in the show.
Right.
And it's just very, very challenging to get the highest end stuff right now.
So
is there any? Sorry?
Oh, so I was going to say, is there any particular Kirby page in the collection that you're glad is in there, or some standouts maybe?
I mean, everything we have. We have a guy named Eric Roberts who's got an incredible collection. He loaned us early Tales of Suspense cover that shows Captain America in combat with the Black Panther. So it was a perfect choice. This is a late 60s piece. It's Cap and the Panther. It's like so for the contemporary audience member, it really feels like a scene out of the Civil War movie. But for the old school fan who knows, that history, they know that, well, here are these 2 characters from the pen of the guy who actually first drew them.
Right.
So that was a beautiful one to have. Let's see what else. We actually have a page from the Fantastic Four showing the moon landing.
Okay.
I think it was around issue 98 or so, which I just thought was a beautiful opportunity to kind of draw a little circle there around the characters. The Fantastic Four were inspired to some degree by, that very first issue. Their origin story is motivated by Cold War kind of logic. I don't know if you've read it recently, but Sue says when Ben Grimm says he doesn't want to fly the experimental spaceship to the moon, Sue says, "Do you want the commies to beat us? Don't have the commies get there ahead of us." So it's an experimental. People forget this, but basically it's an experimental moon launch that is part. It's a space race era story, and that's number 1. And then almost 100 issues later, when we actually landed on the moon, which an event I'm sure Jack was following very closely, he draws this tribute page where he actually has this 6-panel sequence of Neil Armstrong getting out of the Apollo unit and putting his planting his foot on the surface of the moon. And I thought, well, that's just such a great page if we to show, and it's gorgeously inked by Joe Sinnott, and we could at the same time make a nice point with it about the Kirby's imagination always being inspired in some ways by what really, you can imagine for somebody like him, it must have felt like science fiction becoming reality when the moon landing actually happened.
Right. Yeah. Wow.
If I could go back to a minute for what you were saying about having a museum experience and, just the idea of being in awe of these creators and these artists. So I come from an art history background, and I find it incredibly difficult to get art historians to take any comic book artists seriously as artists. Is there something about the discipline of English that you think is more receptive to comic books as a piece of, culture and art that we take seriously and that we put in museums? And did you have any, I don't know, have you ever worked with art historians or museum curators who have an art history background? And, how have you worked together with people?
That's a really, it's an interesting question, and it's a big sort of, it's quite, I think, a live question within comic studies right now, because it seems to have been the case, as you point out, that departments of literature, comparative literature and English, have really embraced comics and so-called graphic novels in a way that the discipline of art history has not. Mm-hmm. That's less true in some ways just at my own institution, in that one of the people most responsible for teaching manga and the history of manga happens to be located in our program of art history. But there are disciplinary questions. If you're trained as a literary scholar, as I am, then you bring a set of methodologies from that discipline, and so there's a sensitivity perhaps to reading allegory, which is of course mm-hmm. one of the things that superheroes are fun to. It's fun to do that with them,
right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Superheroes are big. Douglas Walk once said that superhero comics are the nearest thing we have these days to the novel of ideas, which I think is a beautifully audacious statement, and also nicely captures the what a literary scholar might indeed like about stories like this. They're big. They have these archetypal, symbolic kinds of concepts that happen to look like people. That are engaged in ruminations on both the attractions, the glamour, and the limitations of power. Right? I mean, these are all things that you could imagine an English professor getting easily excited about and feeling like, in some ways, they know how to analyze that. But those are entirely thematic ways of thinking. They don't focus on those are, you're interested in aspects of character, plot, narrative. When you do that kind of analysis, you're not focusing on how these things look. And of course, it's 90% of the appeal of superhero comic. I mean, if I'm reading Jack Kirby, fantastic. Some of my favorite superhero comics ever is Jack Kirby's Fantastic Four work, particularly from, when Joe Sinnott starts inking it, around issue 40 something. Mm-hmm. There's a sort of a 20-30 issue run in the middle there, which for me is one of the all-time pinnacles of the superhero genre in the comic book form. And it's not about the plots and stories are fun, and actually they're deeper than people might initially or superficially recognize. The Galactus trilogy, you can talk about the existential implications of the Galactus trilogy, and you're not wrong to do so. But that isn't why I fell in love with this stuff when I was young, and it was because they look amazing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And they have Kirby has. There are art historical concepts here. Scott Buchanan is an art historian who I think has done this kind of work. Somebody might, if you've never spoken to him, he might be somebody you want to talk to. He's a art historian, film historian. He wears both hats at Stanford University. He wrote a book called Matters of Gravity about science fiction movie spectacle, which has a couple of superhero chapters in it. He's also written a book on Mignola's Hellboy, which I think is a very fine piece of criticism. And he understands both the importance of and the difficulty of talking about the visual. So that's a fairly high-placed art historian kind of guy who likes comics. But yes, for some reason, departments of art history have been very slow compared to literature departments on this, on the appreciation of comics. And then when they do embrace comics, they tend to be much more excited about the more auteurist, comics lit kinds of creators. Crumb is probably the comics artist who's been most embraced by the fine art world in the United States. Mm-hmm. Some of the first comics exhibitions in the U.S. were, the Portland Art Museum, for example, exhibited all of Crumb's Genesis some years ago, right? Or I would say maybe Alison Bechdel, Joe Sacco, Dan Clowes, Art Spiegelman, obviously. These are the kinds of figures that the world of the museum has been a little quicker to embrace. Right. And I think that might be to do with maybe a less than fully acknowledged auteurist bias. All of those creators are writer-artists. They all they can be understood in terms of sort of traditional post-romantic artistic values. As they are individual visionaries, right? Whereas even the most auteur-y, if I can make a word up, of the superhero guys like Kirby and Ditko and let's say Frank Miller, I think would also be equivalent. Howard Chaykin might be another, although he doesn't really do superheroes. But these are sort of commercial comics creators who have what you might think of as a distinctive enough vision as to be thought of as sort of comics auteurs, but they work within a factory system, and it's never just their work that you're seeing. It's always Miller and Janssen, it's always Kirby and half a dozen different inkers. Ditko liked to ink himself, but Ditko's exceptional in every way. I mean, even the period of the period of work that he does, that in a way Ditko is the most auteurist if you think about it, because he kind of tries to invent alternative comics before they even exist. After he leaves Marvel in the 60s and starts doing his strange homegrown, you guys are familiar with this material, right? That late Ditko stuff, Avenging World and all that kind of. I
mean, we may be, but our listeners maybe aren't. I mean, and by listeners, I also mean me. So, if you have a brief explanation into that stuff, I'd love to hear it.
Well, yeah, Ditko's really fascinating from this point of view, because it was like he tried to invent an alternative comics market before the direct market existed, because he was frustrated with what he could do within mainstream comics. What makes Ditko different from the other auteurists is that he's this extreme libertarian Ayn Rand sort of right-winger, as opposed to being... So he didn't fit into the underground movement, the kinds of people that were looking for an alternative comics audience in the 60s and 70s. The distribution mechanism for things like Zap Comics was head shops. Right? I mean, if you wanted to sell comics that weren't superhero or genre comics and that dealt with adult subject matter in the 60s and 70s, then you were an underground cartoonist, and your work probably sold primarily through head shops. And that's not the audience that would have picked up what Ditko was doing, because Ditko was doing these really kind of extreme right-wing weird genre pieces. The later Ditko work, Ditko's still alive, obviously, but Ditko's later work, it reminds me of a kind of, they're like libertarian chick tracts.
Right,
and so, it's very politically unfashionable, to sort of finish the point that I guess the reason I started talking about this is that you could see in Ditko a kind of highly individualistic vision, a romantic notion almost of the artist doing his own thing and pushing against the limits of what a commercial medium will allow him to do. And the fact that he also happened to do it from a rather right-wing perspective, which means that he doesn't get maybe talked about as much as some of the other alternative auteurist types.
Right.
But, he's doing something that historians would recognize as the highly individual sensibility of an artist at work there. Whereas someone like Kirby, it's harder to recognize that because Kirby was really trying to make money in a commercial medium. Kirby never lost faith in commercial comics, even when the audience left him, even when things like, Devil Dinosaur or the Eternals didn't, really set the world on fire. They look incredible now, I think, by the way.
Yeah, Devil Dinosaur, I think, is huge now with Moon Girl, and they sell them at like the book fairs at elementary schools.
Yeah, there's a nice sort of reinvention, but those things look amazing too. I mean, the double page spreads from Kirby's Devil Dinosaur books in the late 70s is not the work of a man who's past his prime. They are the work of somebody who's continuing to push at the limits of what the medium can do. But his sense of it was, it's like the difference between Led Zeppelin and Fugazi or something, and the hipsters are always going to like Fugazi more. But this is, at the end of the day, I just said it. Jack Kirby is the Led Zeppelin of.
That's our episode title right there.
That's perfect. Yeah.
So, okay, I bet Ben has some opinions about using tape on your comic books.
Oh no. So this is an ongoing debate here at I Read Comic Books of how you should store and take care of your comics. And we did do a whole episode a while ago, I want to say a year and a half ago, about like the proper quote-unquote art historian way of storing your comic books, and Tia gave us a beautiful breakdown of that. But recently we've been talking about, do you use the pre-sealed bags for your modern comic books? Do you tape? If you do tape, do you use 2 stripes of tape or 1 stripe of tape? What kind of bags do you use? So on and so forth. Do you have thoughts on this? I guess that's what you were getting at, right, Tia?
Yeah, I think we should just poll everyone that we talk to. But here's a person who actually handles, all kinds of comic books from original art and museum quality, like, first issues to, stuff he probably bought last week. So let's hear it.
Yeah. So I don't worry about bagging and boarding new books at all.
Okay.
I might, just to sort of protect them in a crude storage kind of way. Like I might put multiple books into a single bag if it's modern books, just to save money on the bags. Okay. Because they're modern books, and unless you are a slabbing type of person, and you really are going to try and in future sell your copy of Ta-Nehisi Coates' Black Panther #1 in a 9.8 or something like that. It doesn't matter. In my opinion, with modern books, it doesn't matter. I just read them, and they're all printed on glossy paper that's going to outlive me. And and so now when you're talking about books that are printed on wood pulp. Anything published before the Baxter paper era of the mid-'80s, what you have there is just, from a conservation point of view, you have a ticking time bomb, and there are all kinds of debate, and I have agonized over this. I would love actually to, if you could send me a link to where you talked about this, I would love to get the background, because I use everything that I can to try and slow the degradation of the acid-filled paper. So I use, those paper inserts. What's that stuff called? The microfiber. I use microfiber paper in between the cover and the the newsprint to try and avoid, the acids leaching quite so fast. I put everything in Mylar with acid-free boards. And the jury is out for me as to whether you seal the bag with tape or whether you leave it open. Some people say that if you seal these things too tight, you create a microclimate, which could actually accelerate the aging process.
Oh, no.
Yeah. I have no idea on the science of this, really. I think it's not. I think people really don't know.
In all of the museum print storage places I've seen, it's usually folders and Saunders boxes.
Yes.
Or like a folder with the little closure that you like wind the string around. I can hear all of the archivists and registrars crying about tape anywhere near anything paper.
Yeah, I think, and they don't use Mylar. They just use acid-free.
I mean, this was never for comic books. This would be more for drawings and pamphlets and illustrations and things like that. But yeah, no, I haven't seen Mylar.
I think that's probably correct. I think if the books, what the Mylar does is it makes everything look nicer. And if you are regularly handling your individual books, it probably makes sense. From the point of view of preserving the life of the books, however, I doubt it helps that much. I think what helps is climate control. And again, when you're dealing with wood pulp, and so if you're really worried about this kind of thing, probably having your books in museum quality archival storage boxes, which don't have any acid in the boxes. Those blue boxes that are not your white standard comic book store short box, in other words, but those blue acid-free boxes, and you've got everything stored so that the spines won't roll.
Frankly, even the staples are terrible.
Yeah, no, the staples are terrible. That's why you want the climate control, and you want to have these things in a storage room, in the dark. With a sort of an ideal temperature and a dehumidifier. If you really want these things to last forever, then that's what you've got to do. But I don't know. I think slabbing is evil. I've got strong feelings about that.
Right.
Well, this sounds like it could be a whole
part
episode
two.
in itself. I mean, we could do a part 2 of this. I'd love to, Ben. We might have to have you back for that.
I would love to come back for that. That's like really down in the weeds, nerdy stuff.
Yeah. That's what we're all about here. Well, we're kind of running out of tape here. I don't want to take up all of your time today, Ben. This has been a fantastic discussion. I love hearing about all of this stuff. I wish we had 4 more hours of recording time and all that to go over it, but we've got to wrap up.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Before we go, where can people find you if they need to contact you, if they want to contact you or hear about your stuff and all the things you've got going on?
Sure. So if you just there are several Ben Saunders on the internet, and they are all much more manly than me. So you could say if you find the Arctic Explorer or the UFC fighting champion, then
those are not your alter egos.
Yeah, neither of those are me. And they but if you so you need to add some kind of modifier to my name to make sure that. Or there's also there's a singer from Denmark who's covered in glorious tattoos, who also has my name.
Also not you. Okay.
Also not me.
Ben, there's still time for you. You could get covered in tattoos. You could reclaim it.
I've come this far. I think if you just Google my name, Ben Saunders, and add comics, you will find me right away.
Yeah, that's what I did this morning. So
yeah. And that will lead you, or if you want to find out about the Marvel show, my name plus Marvel, or my name plus Comic Studies will bring you to the University of Oregon Comic Studies page.
And we should mention how long is this exhibit open so people can go see it in Seattle?
It's there till January. And,
okay, great.
And we're actually adding some pieces in just a few weeks. We have Gentle Giant have created life-size sculptures of larger than life, actually, of Hulk, Thor, and Ms. Marvel, Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel.
Oh, wow.
Wow. And the Hulk is going to be 8 foot tall. So
wow. That's awesome.
Awesome. And so that's in Seattle, Washington at the Museum of Pop Culture, I believe?
That's right.
Okay, yeah, so if you happen to find yourself in Seattle in the next, 9 months or so, go check that out. You can follow everyone else on the show on Twitter. You can follow Tia at Portrait of Madam X. You can follow Paul at Oh Hi Polly. You can follow me at Mike Rappin. And you can follow the show at IRCB Podcast, where we post all sorts of things on the internet. And we post polls every Sunday, such as this week's poll, How Does Spider Jerusalem Take His Coffee?
You can also find our Goodreads group. That's where we're all discussing comics we've read, along with some fans over there. I think 300 people, maybe more, are on that group.
Almost 400.
Almost 400, wow. So we have weekly threads and different conversations. This week's thread is all about Solo, the movie, the Star Wars story, so the spoilers over there if you check that out. And then you can also find our podcast on the internet at our website, ircbpodcast.com. We have show notes, a pronunciation guide for hard-to-pronounce names, and merch you can buy, t-shirts, our zine, stickers, and all that stuff.
Please rate the show, subscribe. More listeners is our goal here. We can get more things out there for you. You can email us at ircb@destroythesybe.org.
Infinity Shred does all the music for the show. They're the best band in the universe. We can't thank them enough for letting us use their music. Xander is the king of secret handshakes, and he also edits the show. I want to say thank you to Paul and Tia. Extra special thanks to Ben for being on the show, and thank you to the listeners. Until next time, try a new comic and be positive about it.